Well, joining me live in the studio, thanks for joining me on Easter Sunday, the Greens Home Affairs and Immigration spokesman, Senator David Shoebridge. David Shoebridge, I wanted to ask first about this decision by yourselves and Peter Dutton to kick off these immigration powers to a Senate inquiry. Penny Wong says there's a Peter Dutton-Adam Bandt alliance. What do you make of that?
Well, it's an everybody in the parliament except for Labor position is actually what happened. Every single member of the Senate, except for Labor, voted against rushing through legislation that looked like it had been drawn in crayon without any rational basis behind it, no argument for urgency. And literally every single politician in the Senate, except for Labor, said, we're not going to rush this incredibly undercooked legislation through in 36 hours, and we put it off to an inquiry. That's actually the job of the Senate, to actually look at legislation, try and work out if there's a rationale for it, and have a proper inquiry.
They feel the government, they need it in place by the time of this latest High Court case being heard.
Well, the remarkable...
As a lawyer, do you get that?
Well, the remarkable thing was we had this sort of 2-hour rapid inquiry on the night it was introduced. So we all got a 20-minute briefing in the morning. The legislation was still warm from the photocopier at that point. We then have a 2-hour investigation that night with Home Affairs, and we have, the Minister Ayres, and we have a whole bunch of senior Home Affairs officials, and we say, why is it urgent? The very first question, why is it urgent? They could not give us a reason. And in fact, the Coalition repeatedly said, is it about this High Court case? Do you need it for the High Court case? And they refused to accept it was because of the High Court case. They must have been asked 5 or 6 times.
This is the subtext, I believe, but they don't want to say it. They don't want to be seen to be influencing the High Court.
Well, I think for good reason. You don't want to be passing case-specific legislation because that creates a whole lot of other legal hurdles. But they were literally asked 5 or 6 times and refused to say so. And then when we asked them, well, who's it applying to? Tell us the cohort it's applying to. And they said, people in detention. We said, well, why do you need urgent powers if someone's already in detention? And they said, and also maybe some of the people from the last High Court case, maybe some of the tens of thousands of people on bridging visas, and maybe everybody else on visas as well. And it was shambolic. I've got to tell you, Andrew, it was shambolic. Nobody who was a fair-minded observer would have said this is urgent and needs to be passed.
All right, isn't it fair enough, though, when someone's come here illegally, doesn't have a recognised refugee claim, that there's some mechanism so that you can deport that person home?
Well, we have powers that allow for deportation orders to be made, but we've never yet said, say for a woman who's fled Iran, maybe with her kids, and has had an asylum claim rejected, and that happens not infrequently. We have a very unfair asylum system. Arbitrary time limits, negative inferences. It's a very unfair process. We've never yet said, well, if you continue to fear persecution, even though the government doesn't believe you, we're going to whack you on a plane and return you against your will to potential jail and persecution in Iran. And if you don't do it, we're going to put you in jail for a mandatory minimum of 1 year. And we've never yet said if you don't sign a passport application for your kids and take them back as well, we're going to put you in jail. Even under the Coalition, we never got there. Labor's kind of jumped the shark on this.
All right. The Greens are against mandatory detention, aren't you? Do you accept a lot of Australians would disagree with you on this? What happens when people claiming to be refugees are in fact criminals, murderers, pedophiles, as we've seen in recent months?
Well, if anyone's committed a crime, they should go to jail and serve their time in accordance with the law. But we don't have indefinite detention. I mean, we have jails all across the country which deal with awful crimes. People do their sentence and then get released into the community after they've done their time and after they've done their sentence. There's no reason to say that somebody who has claimed asylum or a refugee shouldn't have the same due process, having done their time, having then been released out into the community. This idea that for people seeking asylum, a crime in their past should mean jail forever, I don't think that's been fully explained by the Coalition of Labor, why just because you claimed asylum, you should be in jail forever for the same crime that would see other people released in the community. It doesn't seem to me to be based in fairness.
It'd be ideal if some of these people were removed from the country, though, wouldn't it? Which is what they're trying to do.
Well, but this won't work. What this will do, I mean, there's two parts to the law. One is putting people in rolling 1 to 2 or 3 year detentions, and people who say their life is at risk if they go back to their country of origin, they're not going to suddenly want to go back to Afghanistan or Iran or Russia. I mean, literally, returning political dissidents to Russia? Would you rather go to jail for a year here or go back and roll the dice with Vladimir Putin? I don't see how this is actually going to work.
What are you hoping to learn from the Senate inquiry into this?
Well, there are 2 key parts of this ledge. One is this power to issue an order, for the minister to issue an order, and if people don't comply with it, they go to jail. We want to explore how that's going to work. You know, the people that the minister wants to issue those orders to, as yet unexplained, although the legislation allows it to be opened up to literally anyone on a visa, anyone who's not a citizen. The second part of it is this blacklisting of countries. And the government came out, and Minister Giles came out and said, oh, well, there's 4 countries that are on the list. There's Russia, there's Iran, there's Iraq, and there's South Sudan. We then, in the inquiry, when the Home Affairs Secretary was asked, you know, tell us about the list, I think her words were, I didn't bring the list with me. And we said, well, where is it? And then she said, oh, there is no list. And the reason that that's important is because there are diaspora communities across the country thinking, well, is my country on the list? You know, if your family's in Pakistan, if your family's in Bangladesh, if your family's in Russia, once a country's blacklisted under this legislation, your parents can't come out and see you, your family can't come out and see you. You're literally punishing diaspora communities for the crimes of the Iranian administration or the crimes of the Russian administration.
What's your view on the future of Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles?
Well, it's not my job to judge their future, but it's my job to judge their job up to now. And you'd have to say that this was shambolic. They thought that they could wedge the Parliament to rush through legislation, and they had no argument for why it was urgent. It was shambolic.
They still might get there with the opposition.
Well, they still might get there, but even the opposition, I think, will be deeply troubled by legislation that is saying to diaspora communities across the country, you may never see your family again.
All right. I wanted to ask about this business concerning the divestiture of stores that you're seeking. The Coalition seems to have their own policy, but they want it restricted to supermarkets. What's your view on that?
Well, we'd love to start with supermarkets. We think it should be a broader power. And we've had some bizarre comments from the Prime Minister talking about these being Soviet kind of powers. These are powers that exist in the United States and have existed for the better part of a century in the United States to break up corporations and trusts that are abusing market power. We just say we want a little bit of that here in Australia. The obvious starting point is Coles and Woolies, who are literally screwing Australians for grocery prices and making, you know, billion-dollar profits while people can't afford to buy broccoli. It's a great spot to start there. We think the powers should be broader. We don't control the numbers in the legislation. We have to work with other parties. But it'd be a great start to have divestiture powers at Coles and Woolies.
Do you welcome Anthony Albanese's Liddell Power Plant solar announcement, and will the Greens be campaigning hard against Peter Dutton's nuclear plants?
Well, we welcome any investment, any serious investment in renewable power technology. And I mean, one of the things about potentially putting a large renewable energy plant at Liddell is it's already linked into the grid. Whether that is the best answer in every case, because you want to distribute your renewable energy sources where you have the best wind and solar, but it does make sense to have some investment at places like that. And we welcome public investment in renewables and the renewable technology industry. In some ways, we don't really need to campaign that hard against nuclear because overwhelmingly Australians realise what a ridiculous proposal it is. You know, decades in the future, energy that comes out at 5 times the cost of renewable energy plus, it makes no sense. It's a sort of aggressive political wedge from Peter Dutton that nobody thinks has a realistic chance.
All right, finally and briefly, Tammy Tyrrell leaving the Jackie Lambie network. What implications does this have for the Senate?
It does change the numbers a bit in the Senate. The Coalition and the Greens together have a majority. The Labor and the Greens and 2 others have a majority in the Senate. That's the way the numbers work. And of course, Labor and the Coalition, they agree most of the time and they have an overwhelming majority in the Senate. And it'll just create another independent. I've always respected Tammy Tyrrell and Jackie. they're interesting people to work with, my view is they're principled people to work with, and I think that'll continue.
Green Senator David Shoebridge, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Cheers, Andrew.
Have a good Easter.